I'm Jenna Seery. I'm a bookseller and co-host of Poured Over, and tonight I am so lucky to be joined by Elizabeth Gilbert. You know her from, well, so many things, from Eat, Pray, Love to The City of Girls to Big Magic and more and more and more. But tonight we are here to talk about All the Way to the River. So thank you all for joining us. All right. I wanted to start tonight by asking you, how does it feel to have this book out in the world?
It's a relief. It's such a relief. It's a book that I've been working on for 7 years, working on at the same time as trying to figure out if I could get away with not writing, trying to figure out if there was a way to write about this without writing about it. The book is, it's challenging. The story is challenging. The writing is challenging. Everything about it is intense. And what are we here? I'm sorry. I'm easily distracted. What does that sound? It's the air conditioning. It feels like we're in the New York City subway right now.
Yeah. We're on an experience together.
Okay.
Okay.
As long as I know what it is. I used to have an apartment in New York, and I remember one night going up at 2:00 in the morning and knocking on my upstairs neighbor's door and saying, "I'm not asking you to stop what you're doing. I just need to get a visual of what you're doing."
Yeah.
Because when I'm lying there in bed, what I think you're doing is dragging chains across the floor. Turned out she was a set designer for theater, and she was building sets in her apartment at 2:00.
What if she had been like, "No, I'm dragging chains.
I'm dragging chains across the floor." Okay, so now that I know what that noise is, I can completely focus.
Okay.
So, yeah, it was a really hard, by the time my partner Rayya died, and we had been through everything that we had been through together, the last thing I wanted to do was think about or talk about what had happened, because it was so incredibly traumatic to experience the person who I trusted the most in the entire world turn into somebody who was the most dangerous person I've ever been around. And so, yeah, it was intense. And I just tried to get away with not writing about it. But the story wouldn't leave me alone. And so I tried to write it as a novel, and then I tried to write it as a book of poetry. I kept writing around it, but ultimately, if there was anything that I ever learned from Rayya, it was go as quickly as you can to the white-hot radioactive center of the truth. That's actually where healing occurs, and it's actually the safest place to be. So now that I've gone to the white-hot radioactive center of the truth, I actually feel more relaxed. So it's a peaceful experience.
I love that. I love that you maybe get some relief now after going through so many things and having to pull it out of yourself almost to put it on the page. And I think there's something so easy to connect to in that, because that is something we've all been through. The idea of I'm not going to do it. I can get through it without doing that, surely. And sometimes we realize we can't.
Yeah.
And that's the thing we have to do. And having the strength and the fortitude and the just sheer force of will to do the thing, I mean, there's something really magical in that.
Well, there's a mythical truth if you look at your life from a Jungian perspective or from a mythical perspective, and I do like to look at my life from a mythical perspective, and I guess already that you do too. You have to face the dragon, or you don't get to have the hero's journey. You have to go into the darkest darkitude in order to find your strength. And the whole sort of concept of the hero's journey is that it's always, I think, best explained by Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. But you're at this point where you're like, don't make me go face the witch and get the broom from the witch. I'll do anything but that. Don't make me have to do that. And I think of everything that I've ever written and everything that I've ever faced, this is the most of that, where it's you're not going to get well unless you go deep into the dark cave.
And that is it just hits you when you read, because everyone's had that in their life. Not everyone has had to write a book about it, but everyone has had that connection, that moment of, if I don't do this, my life will never be the same. But if I do this, my life will never be the same. And that is simultaneously one of the most terrifying and wonderful things. And that just helps us get through. And I think that for me and for so many others that I know, reading is, and writing, but reading for all of us here in many ways is the ultimate act of community. It's the ultimate act of saying, I want to see from your shoes. I want to know you. And in this book, I feel like you are offering us such a great opportunity to say, this is me.
Thank you for sharing that. You're reminding me when I fell in love with Rayya. So for those of you who don't know the story yet, this is a book that talks about my friendship, my almost 2 decades long friendship with my best friend, Rayya Elias. And then toward the end of her life, I'd been sort of secretly falling in love with her for many, many years. And I am excellent compartmentalizer. So I just thought, this is just something nobody ever needs to know about. In fact, I'm going to tuck this truth so far away that I don't even need to know about it. I'm going to put it in, like, remember at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they put the Ark, like in that giant warehouse full of boxes? I was like, I'm going to take this piece of information about the fact that I'm in love with my best friend, and I'm just going to put it in that warehouse where they keep the Ark in Raiders of the Lost Ark, so that I don't even have to look at it, because I don't want this to be true. It's extremely inconvenient. It's going to ruin my life. It has the capacity to ruin her life. It certainly will ruin my marriage that I value and that I care about and that I honor. And so we're just going to put this is just, nope, we're not going to look at this. So the universe hates a secret a lot. Like, the universe hates a secret, and the universe hates a lie. And it was ironic that I was keeping this thing secret from my best friend, because she taught me more about telling the truth than anybody I've ever met. And she used to always say, her famous line was, the truth has legs. And at the end of the day, after all the drama and all the trauma and all the bullshit and all the chaos is blown up, the only thing that's ever going to be left in the room is the truth. That's it. It always will be. It's like everything else will die and the truth will be left standing. And she used to say to me, whenever there was a difficult situation that I was in, or a hard conversation that I had with somebody, or if she and I had to have a difficult conversation, she would say, babe, since the truth is where we're going to end up, why don't we just start with it? Like, why don't we just lead with it? Because it's not going to go away, And yet this truth, that I loved her more than as a friend, that I loved her as my person, that I longed for her deeply, I was like, well, this is a truth that we can never express, because this is going to blow up a lot of stuff that I've worked really hard to build. And then she was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic and liver cancer and given 6 months to live. And at that point, it was no longer possible for me to contain that. And the idea, I had a very strong vision after she was diagnosed, where I saw her in a hospital bed with me holding her hand and her dying, never having told her what she was to me. And then I saw me coming home from that funeral, where people would come up to me and say, I'm so sorry, your friend died, and comfort me at the appropriate level for a friend, without anybody realizing who I had just lost. And then I saw me coming home to my marriage and to my home after that funeral, and taking off my funeral clothes, and nothing in my life ever working again, and nobody ever knowing why, and nobody ever knowing the depth of the grief, and having to keep that buried. And what I saw made my soul so appalled that I had no choice but to have the courage to speak the truth about who she really was to me. It's also the case that I think I'm really good at keeping secrets, and in fact, I'm terrible at it. And I had an ex-boyfriend who said about me one time, you have like the opposite of a poker face. You have like miniature golf face. Like, everything is so obvious on your face. And so when I went to my husband, who I loved very dearly, trembling, to say, I have to tell you this secret, that I'm secretly in love with Rayya, he was like, oh yeah, I know, you've been in love with Rayya for 8 years, and I've watched this happen, but I never said anything because I didn't want to lose you, and I'm glad I didn't, because I've had the most wonderful 8 years with you. But essentially, you've had a husband and a wife for the last 8 years, and you need to go be with your wife. So a toast to that man, by the way. That is the opposite of toxic masculinity. And so I went to be with her, and we had this incredibly heightened, romantic, amazing 6 months together. And then she didn't die because she was very disobedient, even to cancer. And at the end of that 6 months, when her fear of death and pain from cancer got too much to her, she returned to the drug addiction that she thought was behind her. And she became an opioid and cocaine addict again, which she had been for a lot of her life. And she went to the most degraded aspect of her being. We all have these shadow sides and we all have these light sides. I think of our humanity as being like paint strips when you go to the grocery store, or like to buy paint at the hardware store, and there's paint strips, and there's the lightest version of like the tone that you are, and there's the darkest version of the tone that you are. And she went right down to the very darkest version of herself, and I went down to the very darkest version of myself. So she became an angry, abusive, dangerous, lying junkie, and I had never seen that aspect of her before. And I became a spineless, enabling, people-pleasing, codependent that is the worst and most degraded version of me. So over the course of our 20 years together, I got to see the greatest thing that she was, and I got to see the worst thing that she was. And processing that and trying to figure out after her death, who was she? Like, was she this person who I knew for years and trusted and had so much integrity and loved and was the safest person in my life? Or was she this absolutely horrific monster? And the answer was yes. You know, and who am I? Am I this like strong, capable, autonomous, independent, creative, dignified woman? Or am I this absolutely degraded servant to a drug addict? And the answer is yes. And I don't like that answer. Like, I want a clearer answer, but humans are not simple. And so that's another reason why it took me so long to write this book, was because it took me so long to figure out who she was. It took me so long to figure out who I am. And it took me so long to figure out what actually happened. Like, I think of this book as a forensic exploration of trying to figure out how in the world did two people who had the very best intentions end up bringing out the very worst in each other. And in many ways, it's a book about all of our lives, because I don't think any of us get to move through Earth School without having chapters of our life where we're like, how did I get here? Like, how did I end up so far away from myself as this? And how do I find my way back home? And that's ultimately what it's about.
I love that. I love the idea that none of our journeys will ever look the same. We will never go through all the same things, but those feelings that come inside, especially like, you know, when you're sitting in the dark at night and all of your worst possible thoughts appear, we all have the same ones, I think, so often. We all come to the same places. And sometimes it takes reading it in a book or hearing someone else who you think has their life together to say the same thing to feel like, oh, maybe there's something there.
I'm always happy to volunteer to be that person, you know, and I feel like it's actually maybe my job, that my job is to be a writer, but I think maybe my spiritual job, it appears that my spiritual job is to go through universal human experiences that are incredibly frightening and terrifying, and then learn my way up out of it, and then take what I learned and share it by using my own life, like opening up my own life. There's been a lot of questions that I've been getting lately because this book is so raw. Like, raw is the word people are using to describe it, but I think it's actually cooked. Like, I think that I was raw, and then I got well, and now it's cooked, and that's why I can serve it to you.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to serve you raw food.
Right.
Like, I want to serve you, like my friend Martha Beck always says, like, anybody can lead us into the darkness, but can anybody lead us out of it? And so it was really important for me to not tell this story until I had come out of the darkness, to be like, well, here's the path that I took to get out of this despair, this grief, this overwhelm, this confusion, my own shame, my own addictions, and not just talking about Rayya's addictions in this book, but also about my own, what I identify very straightforwardly as a sex and love addict in recovery, as a codependent in recovery. And it was really important for me when I was writing this book, and I write it at the very beginning of the book. I'm going to be talking a lot about my own addictions in this book because I'm going to be talking a lot about Rayya's drug addictions. And I don't think it's fair or ethical for me to talk about this person who I loved and their shadow and not talk about mine. Because also the story doesn't make any sense if I don't talk about mine.
Right.
Because how did these two people end up in such enmeshment unless I had some really unhealed trauma that led me to the place where I was in servitude to somebody who was in such darkness? It doesn't make sense any other way.
And I think one of the reasons that this book feels the way it feels is because you've allowed us into this time in your life to really know you in a way that I don't think we've known you before, even though you've written about your life before. But something feels different here. But I think maybe one of the most moving things for me reading it was that you let us know Rayya, that you helped us know her, and to see her through your eyes from both ends of that paint strip. It feels really special to get to do that. And I think, like you said, there are so many versions of this book that would be impossible to read because they would be hurt too bad for you and for us. But by allowing us to see all the parts, I think it means, yeah, you've cooked it. You served it up for us.
Thank you. It was not another obstacle I had in writing this book was like, do I have the chops to explain Rayya? Because she was such an extraordinary person, and she was so vivid in a particular way. And it's hard to, I'm like, can I get this over the net? Like, is somebody going to read this book and feel like they knew the Rayya that I knew? The Rayya who so many of us who loved her, she was such a legend, but she was like this intimate local legend. You know, like she never reached the level of fame that her charisma should have entitled her to. Like, she was the kind of person who walked in the room and people were like, who's that rock star? And it's like, she's our local hairdresser, you know what I mean? But like, she's a rock star, and she's a legend to every single person who ever met her. And part of the shame that she carried in her life, and part of the shame that she medicated with her drug addiction, was this feeling of that she was supposed to be a more important person than she was, that she was supposed to have had a bigger platform, that she was supposed to have been a bigger star, because she was so obviously a star, but she was so tormented by self-hatred and insecurity and shame. Her queerness was a big problem in her family. She grew up in she grew up in a very traditional Syrian family where you were expected as a girl to stay at home until you got married to a very successful Syrian man. And there was like a very narrow, there's like most cultures keep women's paths very narrow, but the path that she was offered was particularly so. And so she had a lot of shame because she didn't fit into that mold, and she ran away from that life and went to the Lower East Side in the 1980s and was like, instead of doing what you all want me to do, I'm going to be in a punk band at the Pyramid Club and do heroin. And they were like, well, that's even worse than what we had in mind, and she really suffered, but she also had this incredible resilience and this incredible light that was undiminished. Even when I was watching her as a hospice patient who was in total relapse for drug and alcohol abuse, she was still the most vivid person in the room and the most radiant person in the room. Like, there was an essential light in her that seemed undiminishable, to the point that at one point I'm like, is she actually immortal? Like, and one of her doctors said to me, like, how is she alive? Like, what is she surviving on? And I'm like, well, I'll tell you what her diet is. At this point, it's fentanyl, morphine, codeine, cocaine, cigarettes, whiskey, and the occasional hamburger. And he's like, well, it seems to be seems to be working, because she has now lived a year past any expectation that we had for her, and she's living on like 3% liver function right now. And she was just like, rock and roll, motherfuckers. Like, she was just like, you couldn't, like, I'm like, what are you made of? But what she was made of, I think, was like this astonishing charisma and this astonishing energy. And I just didn't know whether I was going to be able to convey that. So I'm happy to hear you say that you feel like you got Rayya off this page. It means a lot to me. And it means a lot to her because she wanted to be known.
And I will know her forever. This book, for all of its pain and trauma and healing and like gut-wrenching moments, is also funny, and it's a love story. And that is so important, I think, for my people to remember, for myself to remember, that this is, for all of the dark parts of this is also a love story. And this is a story of friendship and a wonderful community that you all had surrounding you, especially at the end of Rayya's life. And that those moments are the moments that I find myself thinking back on. Like a moment of pure pain where you think things are really going one way and it's like, actually, we're going to Lululemon. And like those kind of things, I'm like, that's the life that I think we all want.
Rayya, at the end of Rayya's life, her primary caregivers were me, her ex-wife, and her ex-girlfriend. I have since learned this is like super common lesbian culture stuff. Like Andrea Gibson, the poet Andrea Gibson, just died, and in the room were her wife and all her ex-girlfriends. And I'm like, what is it about these lesbians and their ability to keep their exes? But actually, in the recent documentary that you should all see if you get a chance about Andrea Gibson called "Come See Me in the Good Light," it's devastating. And there was so much parallel that I saw in many ways between their community and the community who loved Rayya. But Andrea, they said, when your queerness is not okay with your family and you get exiled from your family of origin because, for whether it's your queerness or that you think differently or that you don't accept the religion that you were trained up in, or there's something that you've done that your family considers you to be extremely disappointing. But they said, especially within the queer community, that your partners become your family. And I remember that Rayya's ex, Gigi, her ex-wife, used to say, like, we were, married for a few years, but we're family forever. And as long as Rayya was alive, I knew I always had a place to go. I knew I always had a room to sleep in. I knew I always had, like, this is like a foundational family member at this point in my life. But we used to joke, because it was Stacy, Gigi, and me, the ex-wife, ex-girlfriend, and me, that she had a blonde from every decade of her life taking care of her when she was dying. And we're like, she's such a thug. Like, how'd she get like all these blondes taking care of her? And like, it's like the Charlie's Angels of hospice care. Like, how are we? But we adored her. And by the time, and on the day after she died, there's a photo of the three of us, and we all look like we just gave birth. Like, we're all, because she died hard and she lived hard and she was difficult to take care of and we were exhausted. But all three of us were just like, had the faces of people, how people look after they had a baby, like sort of like we were like, we safely got her dead. And like, I know that seems like a crazy thing to say, but when somebody is like an addict at that level, for them to die, for Rayya to die in a warm bed surrounded by love, sober, is a miracle. And we were able to make sure that she got that.
I feel so lucky that we get to have this like introspection into how all this happened, because I think it connects for so many of us for things we've all experienced. I mean, we all have grief. I don't know anyone who hasn't lost someone that they love, and especially someone that, their life will no longer be the same. It's a before this death and an after this death. And grieving is the hardest thing you can do, I think, in many ways. There's nothing like it, because we are also told in so many ways to keep it inside. It's a very lonely experience to grieve, even when there are other people that knew the person or you have community around you. No one will ever feel about it quite like you do.
That's well put, yeah.
Even if there's someone who had a similar relationship to them, your grief is always your own. And I think reading someone who has gone to hell and back with their grief. For all of us who have experienced anything even remotely similar, it's like it gives you that perspective to say, oh yeah, this is what it means to be a human. I think grief is just a different kind of love.
It's the tax you pay for love. And it's also, it's not the same thing as depression. And in fact, I've been taught by some very wise people that depression is the refusal to grieve. That a lot of depression is the refusal to feel true grief. Whatever the grief is that you're experiencing, and it's the shutting down of feeling because you think that that feeling is going to kill you. You think that the feeling of grief is going to kill you, but actually the not feeling of grief is going to kill you. But what's terrifying about grief, true grief, is that it feels unbearable and it feels unsurvivable, and it racks if you really give into it and let yourself be in grief, what it does to you, it's like it has its way with you. You know, you can't, it's stronger than you. In that way, it feels very similar to love. Like, I was not stronger than my love for Rayya, and I was not stronger than my grief for Rayya. Like, both were more powerful than any tools that I had to manage them. And I was taught by a beloved friend who was very wise how to move through grief. And she came up with this thing that she called a bow down moment. And she said, when the grief wave comes, it's like passive resistance. Do no resistance to it. Like, no resistance to it, because the resistance to the grief is the thing that actually will hurt you more than the grief. And she's like, you bow down before it like it's a god, because it is, because it's more powerful than you are. And you get on your literal knees. And she always said, like, get on the ground. Like, grief is there to, like, knock you down to the ground if you're doing it right. You know, like, get on the ground, get on your face. She also called it starfishing. She's like, get on your face like a starfish. Just put your face right down and let it break over you like a tidal wave, like a tsunami, because it's huge. But let it, you know, like, just let it. And you just, without the resistance, you just, and I've done that a number of times, and it's wild how you can have these parts where it's like part of me is on the floor, double pumping, heaving, sobbing and wailing, and another part is watching. Like, I guess my consciousness is watching and being like, wow, that's intense. You know? Like, is that okay? Is she okay? Like, is she okay? And like, I would like ask God, like, is this okay? Because this seems like maybe I shouldn't be doing this alone. You know, and God would be like, you're doing great, you're doing great, you're doing great. Like, let it move through you. You're doing great. You're doing exactly right. And then the weird thing is that like 15 or 20 minutes of that is about all the human body can do at that level. So if you let it happen, but it feels like it's going to last forever and you feel like you're going to die from it, but you let it happen and you let that massive energy move through you, and then it moves through you. It's like the grief wave breaks over you and it moves through you. And then at some point you're not crying anymore. And you're like shattered and exhausted and limp, but the energy has moved through you and taken something out of you. And then like, you're like, I kind of need a sandwich.
Sure.
It's like weird. You stand up and you're like, there's still a world. It's like a tornado just went through you and you're like, there's still a world, but now I have to do my email.
Right.
You know, and like now I have to go and like then you go grocery shopping and you do your email. And it's so profoundly weird because like a half an hour ago you were like this sobbing, heaving wreck, and then another one comes, and another one comes. I've never had a kid, but I suppose it's a bit like labor pains. It's like, and death and birth are so similar that makes sense. It's like you know you sob and cry to have something be born, and then you sob and cry to have it leave. It's wild. And then you have fewer and fewer of those, and somehow you're okay. I didn't experience depression when Rayya died. I've experienced depression in my life. I experienced grief, and I also found there was a lot of rage in it. The emotions of grief are very, very hot and very powerful. I had a lot of anger. When I pray, and I pray to the God of my own understanding, so don't get freaked out, because it's cool. But like, when I pray to that God about death and have questions about death, what I hear back is, whose business is death? And I'm always like, yours, not mine. And it's true. Like, and God's like, whose business is your life is your business. Death is my business. And this is the thing that we will never be able to control or understand. But this isn't my business. My business is to live, to grieve, to heal, to remember, and to rejoice.
I had a friend who once told me when I was going through some big bouts of grief that your grief is always going to be the same size, but you're going to get bigger around it.
That's so good. I wish somebody told me that 7 years ago. That's beautiful, Jenna.
And I feel like this book is a manifestation of you getting bigger around that grief.
Oh.
And I think we all get to experience that along with you. And I think that this book is a piece of art in a way. And one of my favorite pieces of this is the inclusion you have of drawings, of poems. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you selected those and how they made their way into this book, because I think it really makes it something special.
Thank you for that. As I was writing it, so I wrote an entire version of this book that was nothing but poetry and prayers. Mm-hmm. And I actually sold that book with the title Aftermath to my publisher with it makes me laugh now, but a 2-page introduction. Because what I was trying to do was I was trying to write about the feelings without writing about the story. Mm-hmm. So I was like, if I write this as poetry and prayer, I can write about the intensity of these feelings, but I don't want to give you any of the backstory because I don't want to talk about it, because I'm still not ready to talk about it. So I had like a 2-page introduction that was like, oh, hey, Liz here. So this is a book of poems and prayers. Like, okay, so I love this person, and then they died, and I was sad, and also I might have an addiction, and they had one, but it's cool. Just here's the prayers and poems. Like, I'm like, how can I do this without doing it? You know,
it's like you're slipping us a note in class.
Yeah, it's no big deal.
Yeah.
It's no big deal, you know. And then I was like, this is crazy. Like, why? I'm not the person who doesn't talk openly about things. And so I went back to my publisher and said, I feel like this is a rough draft of something that needs to be a lot more expanded, to go to your idea of like getting bigger, to hold it all. The book needs to be bigger, and I think the actual story needs to be told. I also had a mystical visitation from Rayya, who was like, bitch, write that book, you know, and go full punk rock with it and like lay it out there and tell everybody everything, or there's no point in doing it at all, which is very Rayya. And but I also healed from when I was in early recovery for codependency and sex and love addiction. I made a lot of art. And I returned to, when I got rid of substances and acting out and all the things, people, places, and things that I was using to medicate myself, when I put all of that stuff down, any of you who have gotten sober know this, you have a lot of time on your hands suddenly. Like when you put down the stuff that you're using to mask everything you don't want to feel, the days become the evenings especially become very long. It's like, what am I going to do with all of this stuff that I used to fill with these things that are killing me, right? So I started just making art, and I don't identify as a visual artist, but I started drawing a lot, and I started illustrating my poetry, and then when I was writing the book, I saw where there were places where I was, like, I'd go back to my stacks and stacks and stacks of journals and make photocopies of certain little sketches and drawings. And I'm like, I feel like this belongs here and this speaks to this. And I also felt like because the book is so intense and so confronting, that we needed to have places where the reader could rest. Mm-hmm. And there had to be like, almost like, you don't want to do it too fast because you'll get the bends. So they were sort of resting stages, like the poems and the prayers were these sort of places of rest, and the drawings were these places of rest. And there are even points in the book where I say to the reader, let's take a break for a minute here. This is getting really intense. Let's talk a little bit about this for a minute, because I needed a break as I was writing it, especially that harrowing middle section of what my Uncle Nick, who's the only other member of my family who's in recovery besides me, longtime AA guru, Uncle Nick, I love him. But he when he read it, he said, "I love your appalling new book," and it's true. It's like, it's an appalling book, and he loved it. Yeah. You know. So when I presented it to my publisher, I didn't ask for permission to put the poetry and the prayers and the drawings. I just built the book as I saw it, which I actually built like a physical mock-up of what I was, and then I brought it in person, because typically we these days turn in books electronically, but I asked my editor if we could meet in real life, and then I, like a kid showing off an art project, I like slipped it across the table to her, and then I made her look at every single page while I stared at her. And I was like, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think?
We're going to put it on the fridge, right?
Like yeah, exactly. Like, do you like my drawings of flowers? Can we put these in the books? And she's like, we'll see about, we'll see. But they did it. And then they put it together even more beautifully than I did. So I wanted the book to have like a 3D feeling. So that's why it needed to have the photos too. There's photos of her and photos of me.
I think having that connection, I mean, I feel like I keep coming back to that, because for me, reading is the ultimate window into life, into someone else's life, but also into my own. It is the time I feel in communion with the world. And so often we get told, this is your life, this is how you're going to live it. But when you write memoir, you suddenly are like, what if my life has changed since the time I wrote this, or the time I wrote that, or said this? And you've had your life out there for us for a long time. Does this book feel different? Were things that surprised you?
It seems to be surprising other people.
Sure. Yes.
I don't feel that it's like, I don't think Eat, Pray, Love is any less honest than this book. It's just that there were some things I didn't know yet about myself, right? So the minute I learn something about myself, I'm willing to put it in public. So it's not like I was withholding. In fact, there are sections of Eat, Pray, Love where I describe my pathology and my romantic relationships, and I use the language of addiction to describe what it feels like for me in romantic relationships, about binging, about purging, about withdrawal, about turning somebody into my drug, about them withholding the drug and me losing my mind, and I use like literal language of addiction to describe my experience. But I thought I was using that language metaphorically.
Right.
It's now that I understand, like, oh, I was perfectly describing what a sex and love addict is. I just didn't know what a sex and love addict was. And I didn't know, like, I'd heard of sex addiction, but I always associated it with men and a certain kind of a cluster of behaviors that were around like prostitution and pornography addiction and like serial cheating. And like, that's not what I was doing. So I wouldn't have thought that that's a 12-step room where I belonged, and it wasn't until I got 12-stepped, until a friend of mine with long recovery in AA sat me down and was like, I've been watching you harm yourself for 25 years in romantic relationships, and I think you might really be served by this program. And I was like, well, actually, it's 40 years that I've been harming myself this way. And also, how very dare you say that I'm an addict? I know Oprah, and I'm a thought leader, and people look to me for,
Yes.
But I went to the rooms, and every single person was telling my story, and that's the really beautiful thing about being, in rooms of recovery, is that the thing that you're the very most ashamed of, that you've been, trying your entire life to make sure nobody ever sees, and that nobody ever knows about you, is what you lead with in those meetings. You just lead with it. You just open with it, and the ceiling doesn't collapse, and birds don't fall dead out of the sky, and the rivers don't run backwards, and everybody's like, "Hi, Liz," yeah, me too, and suddenly there's a space where you can be with the thing that is the thing you most wish you were not, and everybody's fine with it.
I love that. I love the space to be who we are, because like you were saying about narrow spaces to exist, I feel sometimes the more interconnected everything becomes, our spaces to exist simultaneously get bigger and smaller. And I know for myself and for so many others, reading is the way that we connect and that we expand our spaces and we see the world in a different way. And since we are in a Barnes & Noble and talking about books, I'd love to talk a little bit about some of your favorites and some big influences for you.
Oh my God, fun.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you my favorite work of fiction and my favorite work of nonfiction. So my favorite work of fiction, and they're both really obscure, and I'm not doing this as like a deep nerd cut. I'm doing this because these are two of the most important books of my life, and I always say these are the best books you've never heard of. Some of you may, I don't want to, some of you may have heard of them, but my favorite work of fiction is a book called The Summer Book by Tove Jansson. And Tove Jansson is a Finnish Swedish writer and illustrator, most known for a series of children's book called The Moomins. But she also wrote serious adult fiction. And this book is kind of a combination of like a children's book and adult book. And it tells the story of this little girl and her grandmother who spend a summer together on this remote island in the Gulf of Finland, which is in fact where Tove spent her summers as a child. And it's kind of like timeless. It's like this, and they are feral. These two, this child and this grandmother, are both buck wild. Like, they are so untamed, they are so uncivilized, equally. They are both equally creative, equally wild, and so incredibly real. It's like the least precious version of a grandmother you'll ever see and the least precious version of a child you'll ever see. It's really what childhood feels like. And they love each other so much, and they hate each other so much, and they're in a power battle against each other, and they fight, and then they go on adventures, and they play, and they like, and they're in engagement with nature in this really wild way. And only on the second reading did I pick up, I'm like, how did I miss this? There's like this deep, subtle undercurrent, which is that the reason the grandmother is there, because there's a father, but he's like a vague wraith of a shadow who you kind of never see, is because the girl's mother has died. And then, so the book, like the base note of the book is that part of the reason they're acting out, both of them, so crazily and so out of control. And then there's like a huge storm scene. Like it's girls and women don't typically get to have like books that are this wild. Like, this book is like if Pippi Longstockings was real and had a grandmother, like it's a thrilling and beautiful book. So it's called The Summer Book. It's tiny. You can read it like in an afternoon. And it's inspirational to me, not just because how great the book is, but I love the way Tove Jansson ran her life. She was a true bohemian. She was married to a dude, then she fell in love with her best friend. I don't know why I relate to her so much. And she and her best friend, who was also an artist, there's this amazing photos of them, like back in the 1950s. They were like really avant-garde, and they had adjoining apartments in Stockholm, in apartment buildings. One lived in an apartment in one building, and the other one lived in the apartment in the other building. And they built a secret cabinet through the attic where they could go visit each other, not because they were hiding their relationship, but because they each wanted their own space to be artists, because they were each artists. Right, live in the dream. Like, that's right. It's like adjoining apartments with each have your own art studios. Yes, please. And so that's The Summer Book. Tove Jansson's incredible. And then the nonfiction book that I love the most, that you've never heard of probably, is called The Little Locksmith by Katharine Butler Hathaway. And she had and it's a memoir about this woman. She was raised in like a very elite Boston family, and she, as a child, got spinal tuberculosis and was severely disabled, and spent her entire childhood strapped to a board because they were trying, it was like 1915, and they were trying to get her spine to grow straight. So they had her literally tied down for 20 hours a day where she couldn't move, and it didn't even work, right? But for years, she was pinned to a board in a small dark room. But she had 5 little dolls next to her on a windowsill, and she created a universe out of them. And she reports that she had an incredible childhood because she was left alone with her imagination. And then as she grew up, she always heard when she was a child, everybody said like how worried they were about her spine because her spine was growing so crooked. And they said, we're so afraid she's going to turn out like the little locksmith, because there was a locksmith with a hunchback who used to come and do people's keys and locks. And she could never understand why that was bad, because she thought he was incredibly magical, because he was a small person who was bent like her and who had the keys to the universe. And so she became this amazingly, like, ferociously creative force. She was a painter, she was a writer, she was sensual, she had lovers. She took her inheritance and bought an enormous mansion, and everybody said, you're so disabled, there's no possible way you can live alone. And she's like, fuck you, I'm going to live in a fucking mansion, and I'm going to have sex, and I'm going to like paint, and I'm going to make art. And she lived a very short life. She died, I think, in her 30s, and published this book right before she died. And this book is an exaltation of life. Like, this is a person who everyone was like, there's no possible way this person can have a life. Like, and she was like, I'm going to have a bigger life than any of you. And she did. And so she's very similar in a way to Tove Jansson. And obviously, like, that's how I like want to live. And that's who I love, are people who are like, you can't keep me in your rules. I'm going to have like a big, vibrant, extraordinary life, no matter how much pain I'm in. And that's why I was so in love with Rayya when she was diagnosed, because she made this decision. I'm not going to do I don't want to do any chemo. I don't want to do any treatment. I'm just going to do everything I've ever wanted to do, with this sense of great exhilaration. And to be able to be swept up in that for a while before it turned and got really bad was still one of the most heightened experiences of living that I've ever had. So The Little Locksmith and The Summer Book, and they're both like chef's kiss. Amazing.
Perfect. Deep cuts with Liz Gilbert.
Deep cuts.
Well, I can't wait for people to get swept up in this story and to learn about themselves and learn about you and learn about Rayya and just experience what you experienced in a way that I think will really connect and inspire and just be a part of people's lives. Like, I know it'll be a part of mine. So thank you so much for joining us here today and for talking about this book. I can't wait for everyone here to read it.
Thank you, Jenna. And thanks everybody for coming out tonight. And thanks, Barnes & Noble. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.